Today's passage is the very famous story of Noah and the ark and the flood in Genesis 6 through 9. I'm going to spend some time talking about the different sources that I think are behind this text, not for the sources themselves, but as a way of thinking about the cosmological and mythological and narrative and theological elements of each of these sources and how they get combined together into this very interesting and complicated passage. After we look at the sources, I'm going to look at some of those narrative and theological implications, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the strange ancient mythology present in this story as well. So scholars, as we've talked about, argue that in the book of Genesis, there are two primary threads, two primary narrative sources, textual sources that have been woven together. And we talked about how Genesis 1 is a priestly text, and that Genesis 2 and 3 is a different creation story that we call the Yahwist. And those terms are just scholarly terms. They don't necessarily mean anything except to say that the authors behind Genesis 1 seem to be from a priestly tradition, and the narrative style, the textual style, and the theology of Genesis 1 seems to reflect a priestly context, and that Genesis 2 and 3 is more of a folk tradition, and it's called the Yahwist because it uses the proper name of the Israelite deity Yahweh instead of the term Elohim, God, which the priestly source uses throughout Genesis. So when we get to Genesis 6 through 9, we find also Yahwist and priestly elements, but instead of being side by side like they are in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 to 3, they are woven together, and it makes it a little bit complicated to track. And so I have sent to you in email this chart, which combines separates the sources according to particular elements. And I'm going to just talk quickly about what's happening here and how to interpret this chart. So I also have a website that is linked that on livius.org that combines it in this way or separates it in this way. And this is sort of the model that we're looking at, how you have a section here on the right, which is the Yahwist narrative, and then here on the left, the priestly narrative, and then on the right, the Yahwist, and then the priestly comes in with a little tidbit, and the Yahwist with a tidbit, and just sort of back and forth in this way. And in the document I sent you, you can read the priestly all in one group, and then the Yahwist all in one group, and test for yourself. Do you think that each of these makes sense as a narrative separated out with the other material removed? And so let's look back at this chart again. And what happens at the beginning of the story is that in the Yahwist narrative, the focus is on the wickedness of humanity. In Genesis 6, 5, and 8, it says that the Lord, whenever you see the Lord here, this is the Hebrew term Yahweh, the Lord saw that the wickedness of humanity was great in the earth and that everyone is evil. And he was sorry that he made humankind. It grieved him to his heart. And so he says, I'm going to get rid of all these people because I'm sorry that I made them. And so the focus is on the humans and the focus is on their wickedness. Now compare that with this passage, which uses the word God. That's a clue that we're dealing with the priestly narrative. And it's not that the humans are evil in their inclinations, but it's that the earth itself is corrupt and filled with violence. And God decides to make an end of everything because the earth is filled with violence. And I'm going to destroy the people along with the earth. And so the idea is that there is corruption that has leaked in. Now, in Genesis 1, we looked at how God made the world by pushing chaos into the margins, but that chaos survives. And so what we're going to see is that this chaos somehow seems to be infecting the world, and those boundaries set up by the priests, by God in that priestly creation story are now being compromised. Well, when God talks about how to build the ark, we have, again, two different sections. And one of them, the priestly version in 6:14, here just goes through the size, and it's very precise in terms of the size and all that. And that's common for the priestly writer. The animals that are to be taken into the ark is one pair of animals. You shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you, male and female. That's very priestly terminology. Now, compare that with 7:1 through 5, which is the Yahwistic part in which they are told which animals to bring into the ark. And you'll see that instead they are told to bring 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals, the male and its mate. Now, that's very strange. If I had asked you before this video, how many animals did Noah take into the ark? 99% of the people say, 2 by 2, right? 1 pair of each kind of animal went with Noah into the ark, and that is indeed what the priestly writer says. The Yahwist includes 7 pairs of clean animals. Now, the reason for that is at the end of the story, spoiler alert, Noah is going to sacrifice 1 of every clean animal. And if you only start with 2 and you sacrifice 1 of them, well, now you've wasted your effort. And so the idea of having 7 clean animals is to allow for sacrifice and for food and other kinds of things, and you still have these animals available to you. Now, you might think that the notion of clean and unclean here resonates more with the priestly tradition. But the fact is that the priestly writer does not include the clean and unclean, because the question is, when do people learn how to tell the difference between clean and unclean? As we're going to see on next Wednesday, I think it is, the people learn about clean and unclean at Sinai in the revelation to Moses. And so in the priestly chronology, it's impossible for Noah to even know how to distinguish between clean and unclean. And so in the priestly tradition, which is very clear about avoiding things out of order, things out of their chronological space, anachronisms, if you will, the priestly writer says, well, obviously Noah, he can't tell the difference between clean and unclean, so we're going to just do 1 pair of each kind of animal. You also see a difference in when they get on the ark and the flood itself happens in 7:6 and following. This is the priestly version. This is, as you see on the chart, these are kind of woven together a little bit. And so this is the easier to see if you look at the part that's been separated out. Let's look at this one. So in the priestly version here on the left, it says that they went into the ark and as God had commanded them, and then the waters prevailed. The waters prevailed upon the earth. Now the question is, where did this water come from? It says that the fountain of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were open, compared to the Yahwist version, which says that rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Right? This is very different. In the Yahwist version, the flood is caused by rain. And in the priestly version, the flood is caused by water coming through the fountains of the great deep and the windows of the heavens. If you will think about it for a second, you realize that that is the primordial chaos water that was present at the beginning of creation in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, and darkness covered the deep. And God pushes the waters above with the dome and below with the appearance of dry land. But that water is still there all the way through in Genesis 1. And so what happens in the priestly version of the flood, and this is very important, it's the erasure of creation. It's the unmaking of creation. God undoes what has been done in Genesis 1. Now, in the Yahwist version, instead of that kind of really arch mythological understanding of the water, it's rain, and it happens for 40 days. Now, in the priestly version, the water that has come in through these fountains and through these windows swells upon the earth for 150 days. So we have 40 days in one version, 150 days in another version. But eventually the rain stops in the Yahweh's version, and Noah sends out a raven, and then he sends out a dove 3 times altogether. And in the priestly version, it says that God sends a wind that pushes everything back. It says the waters were dried off from the earth here in 8:13. The wind is up here. It says, God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided, and the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, and the rain from the heavens was restrained. I don't like rain there. The waters receded from the earth continually. So this is water going back to those places that God had sent them in Genesis 1, literally the remaking of creation. This is another renewed act of creation, mirroring the act of creation in Genesis 1, compared to the Yahweh's narrative again, which is, well, it quit raining, and then the water eventually receded, and they were able to see the dry land again and get out of the boat. Now, at the end of the story, there are also a few interesting differences. You see that in chapter 8, verse 20 to 22, you have God talking about, so what happens is God says, I am never going again to curse the ground or destroy people because of what they did, because they are evil from birth. And he says that because Noah has offered a burnt offering on the altar. So when Noah gets off of the boat, he offers up of the animals, and then God smells the pleasing odor of the sacrifice and realizes, you know what? I think I need to accommodate myself to this creation. I'm not going to destroy them again. Now, in the priestly version, there is no sacrifice, as I said, and instead of that kind of sacrificial relationship, the focus in the priestly version is covenantal. And so God is now blessing Noah and says to him, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and I'm going to give you all of the animals on the earth, and you can eat what you want, and I am establishing my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. And so this is a covenantal arrangement, which is also makes a lot of sense with the priestly tradition as well. And when Noah is told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, that's, again, a mirror of the words to the humans that are made in Genesis 1:27, where he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So this is a renewal of the creation. Covenantal relationship, very priestly in its theology, compared to this much more sort of earthy story in the Yahwist. And it also is different at the end. It's the Yahwist version that tells the story of Ham seeing Noah naked and drunk. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And the priestly version just ends with the fact that Noah lived an extra 350 years, and altogether 950, and then he died. That seems very tiresome to live 950 years. But so when you break it up like this, it's kind of interesting. You can see the mythology, you can see the cosmology present in each of these, especially in the priestly version, how the cosmology mirrors that of Genesis 1. You can see also some interesting mythological elements. For example, in the ancient Near East, there are versions of a flood story. There's one in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and then a text that is closely related to it called Atrahasis. And in each of those stories, it tells the story of a man who has a good relationship with his God, and the gods have decided to destroy the world. And when they get ready to send the flood, the God goes to his favorite man and tells him to build a boat. And he builds a boat, and it survives the flood. And at the end, he's sending out birds. And at the end of the when the waters finally recede, he gets out of his boat and makes a sacrifice. And interestingly, when he makes a sacrifice, then all the gods smell that sacrifice and they realize how hungry they are, that they need that sacrifice as their food. And they were like, oh man, we were idiots to destroy all these people. We need to keep them around to provide food for us. Now, the argument would be that the story in Genesis, which is much later than that ancient Near Eastern story, is influenced by those motifs, is influenced by that original story. It has some interesting differences. So the sacrifice in chapter 9 is not the food of the gods. It's not food for God. He's not hungry, but he does like the way it smells. That's something we'll come back to when we read Leviticus 1 through 5 next week. And this idea of God choosing a particular person to survive this cataclysm. And in the ancient Near Eastern story as well, at the end of that story, the gods decide, well, one problem we have is that there are too many people. And so they try to limit the population through a series of changes. For example, they make a certain number of women become virgin priestesses, so they are not in the populating pool. And they institute infant mortality. And you see that again in Genesis. It says that after the flood, God decides he's going to limit the lifespan of people to a certain number. And so after the flood, what you see is the lifespan of people slowly decreases until it's closer to 100 or whatever, more of a natural, normal number. One other mythological element, which is kind of interesting, is at the beginning of the story, it talks about the angels, sons of God, having sex with human women and creating these giants, these heroes of old called the Nephilim. And there just is this strange little note here in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Some people have tried to connect this with the wickedness of humankind in verse 5, that this was a fundamentally wicked thing that they did and was part of the reason for the flood. I think this is just a little snippet of an old story here, but it does get picked up later on in the book of 1st Enoch, which tells the story in more detail. I mean, it's making up the story, but telling the story in more detail about these angels that are having sex with human women and having children. And it tells that they all got together and decided, hey, let's go take wives for ourselves among these women, and here are all their names. Semias is their leader. And then what they do is they teach people how to do stuff. They taught them medicine, incantations, roots, plants. The women became pregnant and gave birth to great giants whose heights were 300 cubits. That's how long the ark was, right? So these are gigantic creatures. And then the giants turned against the people and started eating them. And so, things have gone off the rails. But Azazel taught people war, the making of swords and knives and shields and breastplates. And it taught women bracelets, decorations, makeup. And so these angels are teaching people basically how to manipulate and dominate and control other people, the men through warfare and the women through makeup and decoration. So that's obviously some misogynistic understanding of female beauty. But what happens is then everybody's crying out because of what's happening here, and all these giants and things are going off the rails. And the people cried, and their voice reached unto heaven. And what happens is God finally decides, you know what, I'm going to get rid of these creatures, and things have really gotten messed up here. And so the flood is about to come upon the earth, and all that is in it will be destroyed. And so then he tells the story of the flood, which is also destroying these creatures that have been created in this union between angels and women. In Numbers, the book of Numbers, which is after the crossing of the Red Sea, the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness. They send spies into Canaan to see should they go into Canaan or not. And the spies come back and say that we saw the giants. And so the Nephilim are mentioned again and are somehow still around. That's a very curious note that seems to imply, read one way, that the Nephilim survived the flood. That's one of those unanswerable questions. By way of finishing up, I want to turn to the question of interpretive issues, interpretive questions that come up in this process. Well, one is the question of sin and judgment. So in the Yahwistic narrative, God says, look, people are wicked. People are evil in their heart from youth, and so I'm going to destroy them. At the end of the story, after Noah makes his offering, God says, I will never again destroy, let me go to it. I will never again destroy the people. So God says in chapter 8, starting in verse 20, after Noah has done this offering and the Lord smells the pleasing odor, he said in his heart, which is to say to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. Now there's going to be seed time and harvest, summer and winter, day and night, right? The world has now settled down into a rhythm, into a pattern, and it's going to continue as it is. Now, I see this as God accommodating himself to the wickedness of people. This is the Yahwistic narrative that starts with the story of Adam and Eve and the disobedience in the garden and the expulsion from the garden. You see the Cain and Abel story, also Yahwistic, and now this story. And so there's this theme of human sin, human disobedience, human fractiousness that continues actually after this story into the story of the Tower of Babel, after the flood. All of these together are a process of God trying to figure out how to perfect this creation. We talked about it as an ongoing process of creation, an inceptive process of creation. And here, this is a momentous event where God decides, I am not going to perfect this creation. These people are not perfect. They're not perfectible. And even after this horrible, complete destruction, we're back where we were. And I realize that, so I'm going to accommodate myself to it. And you could argue that there is this reflection on sin and judgment all the way through the Hebrew Bible and actually into the New Testament, for that matter, that really resonates with this moment in the story. I think one of the themes that we have to talk about here is the problem of violence. That's a very violent story, a very shocking story. We find in this story that God is killing literally almost everything. So we have to deal with that, I think, especially considering the fact that it ultimately is unsuccessful. It has no effect. It doesn't fix the problem it was meant to fix. So it was wasted effort, senseless loss of human life. I don't know. That's one argument you could make. So I think that in general, biblical readers in the modern day have not fully wrestled with the violence in the story. Here we see some images of different depictions of the flood. And my favorite is from the Brick Testament, something we have looked at. And here these are various images from the Brick Testament that I think do a really nice job of showing the human toll of this event. And also in the clip that I sent you from the 2014 Noah movie, there's a very clear sense of the human toll. And there's a scene where after the waters have risen and they're sitting in the darkness in the boat and you can hear all the people screaming and crying and shouting out in the waters and they're drowning. That is a very powerful moment that gives you a sense of the horrible nature of this. Now, the problem is we don't like that about this story. We don't like the violence inherent in this story. And so one of my favorite Christian writers is named Frederick Buechner. And Buechner argued that the flood narrative is so terrible that in order to protect ourselves from it, the only way we could do that was to turn it into a children's story about animals. And so you have, for example, this kind of thing. Soho baby crib bedding 10-piece Noah's Ark. And if you just go in here, you can find any number of these kinds of things. Noah's Ark crib sets, Noah's Ark wallpaper, Noah's Ark toys. And many students over the years, if I asked them, say yes, they had a little toy that was the Noah's Ark with all the animals, or they had artwork or blankets or other kinds of things in their bathroom or their bedrooms that were themed around Noah's Ark. Like, what is it about having here, this image is of an infant bedding with an image from a story in which God kills everyone. Well, there are no people being killed in this. It's a refactoring of the story to be not about violence, not about God killing everything, but rather about animals, about giraffes, about elephants. So I think that's worth paying attention to when we think about how modern readers engage with these stories. And the fact is that we're very good at ignoring the things that make us uncomfortable and distracting ourselves with elements that are a little easier to deal with. Now, that leads me to my final point, which is there is one bit of interpretive tradition that we also have sometimes forgotten about, but that is very important to consider, which is that after the flood is over, there's this story about how Noah invents wine, which is pretty great that he did that. Thank you, Noah. And he drank too much, and he's laying naked in his tent. And then Ham comes in, the father of Canaan, and sees him. And then the other two brothers, Shem and Japheth, cover Noah up without looking at him and are more respectful of his naked body. And when Noah wakes up, he knew what his youngest son had done to him, which means, that, by the way, that his brothers ratted him out. And he said this, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." So Canaan here is not Ham. Canaan is the son of Ham. And the Lord is going to bless Shem. Let Canaan be his slave. The Lord blesses Japheth. He lives in the tents of Shem, so Shem is the main one, and let Canaan be his slave. So in the original context, what this story is there's a lot of these in Genesis where individual people groups and nations that are Israel's neighbors and enemies to some degree are described, their origins are described in ways that are shameful. So we're going to see next week the story of Lot and how his daughters get him drunk and have sex with him. And the two sons that are born of that very shameful sexual act become the Ammonites and the Moabites. This is a similar story, right? Here's this shameful narrative about Ham, and it is used to describe the origins of Canaan, who are Israel's, I don't want to say enemies, but certainly opponents in the story. They're their foils in the story. And later on, there in Leviticus, it says that Israel is allowed to keep Canaanites as their slaves. And this is why. Now, what happens is that in the American South, preachers such as Richard Furman argued from the Noah story and from Leviticus and other places that the Bible condones slavery and that Africans are the descendants of Ham and that white people are the descendants of Shem. And so God now has said that black people can be the slaves of white people. And also this act of Ham in recklessly barging in at his naked father's room is an example of the recklessness of black men and that they need to be controlled, that basically there needs to be this level of hierarchy, this level of control, even of slavery between white people and black people. So that's a fundamentally racist interpretation of the story as an example of how people use the Bible to support their own agendas, to support their own politics, and in this case, to support their own prejudices, their own racism, and their own oppression of an entire group of humans. At the time, Richard Furman and other preachers like him who were using the Bible to support slavery were using the methods of interpretation that were well known in their day. They weren't renegades, they weren't reckless, they weren't making it up. They were reading the Bible responsibly and carefully according to the rules of their day. The difference is that they were blinded by slavery. They were blinded by their sinful, I would argue, sinful, depraved addiction to chattel slavery in the American South. And so we have to reckon with how does our own context have just powerful effects on the ways in which we read and the huge blind spots that we have. We have to ask ourselves, what are our blind spots? How do we let the Bible blind us to particular problems or things that we're doing that are similarly depraved?